Buried amid the text, but permeating every line, were sections designed to do nothing but shore up Selassie's power, to make sure no one could so much as question him. Selassie wanted a bright, shiny new future for Ethiopia, all right, but only if he was eternally at its very top. It would be this ambition that would turn the final act of his remarkable life into such an avoidable tragedy. So far in this video, we focused on the story of Haile Selassie, the man, the mortal human who became Ethiopia's emperor. But there's another story playing out there in the background, taking place at roughly the same time. The story of how Haile Selassie came to be revered as a god. Unlike our main story, this version of Selassie's tale begins in 1916, when Marcus Garvey announced to his followers, "Look to Africa for the crowning of a black king. He shall be the Redeemer." At the time, of course, Africa was mostly a patchwork of European colonies. A truly independent black king wasn't something that came along very often at all. So when Haile Selassie was crowned at a grand ceremony in 1930, it felt to many among Jamaica's poor and disenfranchised that Garvey's prophecy had come true. Over the following years, the religious teaching that Selassie was Jah incarnate began to spread over the island. Taking its name from his old title and birth name, Rastafarianism would become one of the Caribbean's great social movements, a movement turbocharged by the Italian invasion. Playing into Rastafarian concepts about Babylon, in this case colonial society, oppressing black people, the invasion became a rallying cry. When Selassie retook the throne, it only confirmed that he was the prophesied Black Messiah. This elevation in Rasta thought soon got caught up in other cultural currents swirling through Jamaica. After denouncing Selassie as a coward, Garvey changed his mind and started making Ethiopia a focal point of his Back to Africa movement. This, in turn, influenced Rastafaris until Selassie's kingdom came to be seen as the promised land of Zion. It probably helped that after World War II, Selassie had established a land grant around Shasamani village that black people from the Americas could settle in. Initially intended for those from the USA, it soon became a focal point of a minor wave of Rastafari immigration. Finally, in 1966, the emperor made a state visit to Jamaica, touching down in Kingston on April the 21st. So many Rastas swarmed the airport that they took over the runway, turning a working transport hub into an impromptu religious carnival. For Rastafarians, Selassie's arrival in Jamaica was effectively his second coming. To this day, April the 21st is still celebrated as Ground Nation Day, the day Jah walked among the ordinary men of Kingston. Yet even as Rastafarians abroad were deifying him, back home, Selassie's reign was beginning to lose its shine. The trouble was, all those young elites Selassie had encouraged into his new schools were now adults with enough education to question why they were still ruled by an autocrat. It didn't help that Selassie responded to a failed coup by forming a new government composed of the aristocracy and military elites. The impression was of an emperor no longer taking his nation forward, but rather holding it back, especially when you looked to Eritrea. In 1962, Ethiopia had dissolved its federation with its northern neighbor in favor of outright annexation. This had led to an insurgency erupting that tied up the army and brought in a constant flood of bad news. It was about to get even worse. As the 1960s rolled on, other ethnicities within Ethiopia's patchwork of peoples would begin to stage their own revolts. He may have just been recognized as the living incarnation of God, but the mortal man who was Haile Selassie would soon have a much bigger problem, making sure that living was exactly what he continued to do.
If you want to eat healthy and feel your best, you gotta try cassava. Cassava is the world's health.
By the close of the 1960s, it was clear Ethiopia was in trouble. In the cities, socialist-inspired students were agitating for land reform. As their Leninist doctrine spread, so did the idea that ethnicities should have the right to secede, a right many disaffected groups eagerly grasped. Soon uprisings were springing up alongside the conflict in Eritrea. Gojam erupted, as did Sidamo and Tigray. But it was in Wollo that the match would be lit on the pile of resentful dynamite now underlying society. In 1971, a terrible drought struck Ethiopia, laying waste to the countryside. That year, food stocks had to be eaten to supplement the terrible harvest. When drought again hit the following year, even the seeds and the grain was consumed. All of this led to an inevitable and horrific outcome in 1973, famine. Today, it's unknown exactly how many died in the Wallow famine, although estimates place it as around 200,000 people. But the real problem was Selassie's reaction. Rather than beg the international community for help, the emperor tried to hide what was happening, even throwing sumptuous banquets to cover up the food scarcity. So when the news finally broke, it made the emperor not just look callous, but actively cruel. And that tipped the scales from "we need reform" to "that has to go." In June 1974, following 6 months of strikes, rioting and chaos, a bunch of military officials and self-proclaimed socialists formed a committee known as the Derg. On September the 12th, they overthrew Selassie in a coup, dragging him from his palace as crowds jeered and shouted insults. Initially, the Derg wanted to place Selassie's son on the throne, but when Crown Prince Asforwassen refused to go along with them, the Derg were all like, "All right, fine, I guess we'll just rule by ourselves then." The announcement of a communist state on December the 20th effectively ended the Ethiopian monarchy after 3,000 years. In its place came a military junta that would take Ethiopia into a series of wars and famine far more terrible than anything that happened on Selassie's watch. But the last emperor, around to see it. On August the 27th, 1975, the Derg tersely announced